On shore, Lieutenant Harris and his officers stared at the grainy live feed. The river floor shifted into view, and there it was, an upside-down car, half buried in mud, its shape and size unmistakable. Faded red paint gleamed faintly under the diver's lamps. "That's it," an officer whispered. After 14 years of searching, the red Cavalier had been found. The site was locked down. Forensics rushed in. A crane groaned as steel cables were lowered into the current, wrapping around the frame. The crowd on the bank watched in a silence so complete it felt sacred. Muddy water swirled violently as the cables strained. And then, at last, the roof broke the surface. The car rose from the depths, dripping silt and river weed, carrying with it the unbearable truth. From behind the barrier, Mary and Jessica Carter clung to each other. Mary collapsed, clutching her scarf as sobs tore from her chest. Jessica's tears streamed unchecked, her head shaking in denial as though she could will the moment away. For 14 years they had waited, and now the answer loomed before them, cruel and undeniable. The Cavalier was dragged onto the bank, its body warped. Windows shattered, interior clogged with mud and debris. And then came the discovery that ended all hope: human bones visible in the front seat. Officers quickly shielded the scene with tarps as forensic teams moved in, carefully collecting every fragment, every shred of evidence. When police told, the family remains were inside, likely Melissa and Emma. Mary fainted in grief, medics rushing to her side. Lieutenant Harris stood still, his eyes burning red. He thought back to the endless searches, the wasted nights, the dead ends. The answer had been here all along, lying silent beneath the river. 14 years, he whispered, watching as the car was hauled away to secure storage. Fairhope sank into collective mourning. News broke instantly. Red Cavalier found in Mills Creek, believed to be missing mother and child from 2007. Photos of the rusted, mud-caked car spread across social media, reigniting a mystery the town had tried to bury. "Why did it take so long?" people demanded. "Who failed the Carters?" Jessica remembered the moment vividly. "When I saw the car rise from the water, I knew hope was gone. But at least my sister and niece weren't forgotten anymore. At least we could bring them home." Emma, 16, was shielded from the scene. But when she heard the news, she wept alone in her room. For her, the truth was final. Her mother would never come back. That day at Pleasant View Road became part of Fairhope's history. It reopened the case, yes, but it also reopened every wound, every grief, every unanswered question. For Mary and Jessica, it was the cruelest revelation. Their daughter and granddaughter had been here all along, less than 10 miles from home, hidden by the river's silence. As the last light of day shimmered across Mills Creek, the police cleared the scene, and the crowd slowly dispersed. But one thing remained. On the riverbank, Jessica's bouquet of white roses and yellow daisies drifted into the current, carried away like a final prayer, and with it went the tears of a family who had found their answer, at the cost of everything they had hoped to keep alive. The red Chevy Cavalier was hauled to the Baldwin County Sheriff's evidence yard, a ghost of a car caked with mud, algae, and rust. Forensic teams began the painstaking task of cleaning it, each brushstroke a balance between removing years of river decay and preserving fragile evidence. As the mud gave way, heartbreak surfaced. The seats held human bones, some small, some large, all fractured by water pressure and time. Alongside them lay fragments of a life, a tattered beige purse, a child's sandal, scraps of clothing, and a teddy bear with half its face gone. Each item was sealed, logged, and sent to the Alabama State Forensics Lab. Mary and Jessica were told the truth would take weeks. For them, it was déjà vu, another cycle of waiting, but this time for confirmation of the unthinkable. Emma, 16, clutched an old photo of her young mother, writing in her diary, "If the DNA confirms it, it means Mom was under that river all the years I grew up and I never knew." In late March of 2021, the press conference drew a packed room. Lieutenant Harris, voice heavy with grief, announced, "DNA testing confirms the remains belong to Melissa Carter and her 2-year-old daughter, Emma Carter. We officially declare the 2007 disappearance a fatality." The room fell into silence. Mary collapsed, sobbing into Jessica's arms, while Emma sat apart, her eyes dry, her tears long since spent. Knowing the truth was one thing. Hearing it spoken in the cold language of law cut even deeper. But the case was not closed. Forensic experts revealed a stunning twist. Male DNA had been found inside the car. On the steering wheel, the gear shift, and the driver's seatbelt. It was not Melissa's. It was not Emma's. Someone else had been in that car. Dr. Laura Finch, the forensic lead, confirmed. This DNA belongs to a man, and it predates the submersion. It's external. It doesn't belong. The revelation shattered the long-standing accident theory. For 14 years, most believed Melissa had simply lost control in the fog, her car slipping into the creek. But the foreign DNA suggested something darker: coercion, interference, even murder. The hunt began anew. Investigators first tested Les Turner, Emma's father. He was cleared. No match. Then Scott Reynolds, Melissa's boyfriend at the time, was summoned. Now in his 40s, he reluctantly gave his DNA. Again, no match. The question grew louder. Whose DNA was in Melissa's car, and why had it been there? The sample was fed into the National CODIS database. While awaiting results, the entire 2007 case file was reopened. Old statements were reread, rumors reconsidered. "We thought Melissa might have crashed," Lieutenant Harris told a reporter. "Now we know better. If a man was in that car, this was no accident." In Fairhope, the news exploded. For some, it confirmed the suspicion they'd whispered for years. Melissa had been silenced by someone, not fate. Others looked over their shoulders, horrified that a killer could have lived freely among them for over a decade. For the Carters, the revelation was devastating. "This means my daughter didn't just die by chance," Mary sobbed. "She was harmed." Jessica squeezed her mother's hand, whispering, "At least now we're closer to the truth." Emma trembled as she wrote in her diary. 14 years, people thought Mom just drove off the road. But no. Someone was there. Someone made sure she never came back. And they're still out there. The male DNA discovery turned the Carter file from a tragic cold case into an active murder investigation. After 14 years of silence, justice was finally back in motion. But with that came heavier questions than ever. Who was this man? What happened inside that car on September 12, 2007? And how had he walked free while a family drowned in grief? In May of 2021, the DNA sample was sent to a cutting-edge forensic genealogy lab in Montgomery. Using advanced technology, analysts began tracing it to distant relatives found in public databases. Bit by bit, segment by segment, they built a family tree that might finally give a name to the ghost inside Melissa's car. When the results came in, they hit like a thunderclap. The foreign DNA from Melissa's car traced directly to the Reynolds family, a genetic match pointing toward Scott Reynolds, Melissa's former boyfriend. For 14 years, Scott had been a central figure, a man questioned but never charged. Now science placed him in the very vehicle where Melissa and Emma's remains were found. Lieutenant Harris slammed his hand on the table. "We spent a decade circling back to the man everyone suspected from the start." Detectives began tearing through the old case file, re-examining Scott's life in Mobile in 2007. A close friend of Melissa came forward, recalling how, just a week before her disappearance, Melissa confided that Scott was becoming increasingly controlling and volatile. She wept on the phone, admitting she wanted to end the relationship but feared what Scott might do if she tried. Former neighbors painted an equally chilling picture. Shouts echoing from his apartment, Melissa fleeing in tears, and one woman who saw Scott grab her so hard in a Publix parking lot that she nearly fell. Scott's alibi from that September night quickly unraveled under scrutiny. Back in 2007, several friends swore he had been with them. But, when re-interviewed, their certainty crumbled. One admitted, "I don't clearly remember Scott being there. We vouched because he asked us to." Another confessed he arrived late, well after 11, looking stressed and drinking heavily. Combined with his history, an ex-girlfriend who reported him for assault in 2005 before withdrawing out of fear, a co-worker who accused him of harassment in 2006, the portrait that emerged was of a violent man with a history of rage, cornered by a relationship Melissa no longer wanted. Under the weight of this evidence, police brought Scott back into Baldwin County's investigation office. Now in his 40s, gray creeping into his hair, he tried to maintain composure. Asked why his DNA was on the steering wheel, gear shift, and driver's seatbelt, he deflected. Of course my DNA could be there. I drove that car a few times. Investigators shot back. This wasn't casual contact. The pattern shows you were in the driver's seat when that car went down. Explain that. Scott faltered, muttering he didn't remember. It's been too long. His evasiveness only deepened suspicion. Pressed again, he repeated, I didn't hurt them. I'm not involved. For the Carter family, the revelation was devastating. So my daughter was right to fear him, and we couldn't protect her, Mary whispered, her knees buckling. Jessica, her anger uncontainable, told reporters, if the police had dug deeper in 2007, maybe we wouldn't have lived 14 years in darkness. Emma, now 16, received the news like a wound to the soul. In her diary she scrawled, so the man my mom once loved took her, and me, from this world. How could I ever forgive that? In Fairhope, Scott Reynolds' name ignited fury. Locals whispered of his temper, recalling rumors they'd brushed aside. News outlets descended, calling it the turning point of a cold case. At a press conference, Lieutenant Harris declared, thanks to DNA genealogy, we now have undeniable evidence. We believe Scott Reynolds is directly linked to the deaths of Melissa and Emma Carter. This is no longer a cold case. It is a homicide investigation. For the Carters, those words were bittersweet. Justice was finally within reach, but it also meant confronting the darkest truth. For investigators, the challenge was clear. DNA had placed Scott in the car. Now they had to rebuild the night of September 12, 2007, piece by piece, until the full story of Melissa's final hours could stand unshakable in a courtroom. It promised a long and bitter battle, a fight stitched with justice, truth, and the Carter family's unyielding grief. On an April morning in 2023, as the first light bathed Fairhope's quiet streets, Baldwin County Police launched an operation that would shatter the town's peace. Their target, the Reynolds & Company construction office, where Scott Reynolds, now a polished businessman, was in the middle of his routine meeting. Scott, 43, dressed sharply in a gray suit, was no longer the hot-headed youth from 2007. He had remade himself into a local success story, a contractor lauded in business magazines, a member of the Chamber of Commerce, a donor at church events. But when the glass office doors burst open and officers read the warrant for first-degree murder, the room froze. Scott's eyes widened, his hands trembled, and as the handcuffs clicked shut, the mask of respectability shattered. Employees covered their faces. Some filmed the arrest on their phones. Within minutes, images of the once celebrated businessman being led away in chains spread across social media like wildfire. In a matter of hours, headlines screamed, Fairhope's golden son accused of murdering Melissa Carter and her child. At the Magnolia Street Cafe, where his photo once hung on the wall as a scholarship donor, the owner quietly took it down. One neighbor told TV cameras, we admired him. Who knew such a man lived among us? For the Carter family, the news was a devastating confirmation. Police informed them just before it broke publicly, but even then, Mary collapsed in her living room, overwhelmed by hearing the name she had long feared. Jessica tried to steady her, though her own body shook with rage and grief. For them, this wasn't just an arrest. It was proof Melissa and Emma had died by human hands, not by fate. Emma, now 18, sat alone in her small bedroom, scrolling through the flood of news on her phone. Tears streamed down her face. All her life she had lived in the shadow of the unanswered question. Where did my mom go? Now she had an answer, and it was a name she knew too well. In her diary she wrote, Mom, I always felt someone took you from me. Now I know it was him. At the press conference, prosecutors laid out the evidence. Scott's DNA in the car, his contradictory statements, and witnesses who confirmed his violent arguments with Melissa before her disappearance. We have sufficient grounds to prosecute, the Baldwin County District Attorney declared. Lieutenant Harris, his voice breaking after 16 years of pursuit, told the cameras, 16 years, and we can finally say justice is near. Fairhope itself erupted in division. Some were outraged that a man who donated to schools and stood smiling at ribbon cuttings had lived a double life. Others doubted the strength of the case, fearing weak evidence and wrongful conviction. Social media exploded with fury. He lived free for 16 years while the Carters suffered. Justice late is better than none, one post read. Another countered, what if the DNA was contaminated? Are they just trying to close the case? State and national outlets seized the story. TV channels played Scott's polished image at charity events side by side with footage of him in handcuffs, a contrast so jarring it left viewers stunned. At breakfast diners, churches, and workplaces, the talk was endless. How could this man fool everyone for so long? Yet not all were surprised. Old acquaintances told reporters Scott had always been quick-tempered, polite on the surface but snap in a heartbeat. To them, the DNA revelation only confirmed what they'd suspected for years. In front of Baldwin County Courthouse, supporters of the Carter family gathered with signs reading, "Justice for Melissa and Emma." Others voiced skepticism, questioning why it took so long for police to act. The community was split, but one thing was certain: the fight for justice had finally begun. The Carter family, thrust into the glare of cameras, struggled to stay whole beneath the crushing weight of the media storm. Mary Carter, frail and weary after 16 years of waiting, stood before reporters, her voice trembling. "I thank God that justice has finally come. But I am furious it came so late. My daughter and granddaughter lay under that river for 14 years while he attended parties and was praised as a role model." Jessica, more blunt, seethed with righteous anger. "I want to look Scott in the eyes in court and ask why. Why did my sister and little Emma have to die by your hands?" Emma, now 18, became the unwilling center of attention. At a community prayer vigil standing before hundreds, she spoke publicly for the first time. Her voice cracked, tears threatening to silence her. But she pushed forward. "I never had the chance to call her mom the way other kids do. I grew up with a void nothing could fill. Now the person responsible is exposed, and justice feels closer. But my heart is shattered." The crowd wept openly, strangers stepping forward to embrace her, silently promising she was not alone. Old friends of Melissa shared bittersweet memories on television, how she dreamed of becoming a nurse, how she confided that Scott frightened her. One friend whispered through tears, "If we had listened more, if the police had believed her, maybe she wouldn't have met such a tragic end." The words fanned the town's anger, layering guilt atop grief. Fairhope itself split down the middle. Those who once worked with Scott on charity projects and church events felt betrayed. He shook my hand, promised to help the community, smiled in my face, and all along he carried this darkness, a local pastor confessed. Yet Scott's defense attorney pushed back, declaring on television, "DNA only proves presence, not murder. There is no direct evidence my client caused their deaths." Doubts seeped into some corners of the town, fears rising that justice might again slip away. Mary turned inward, spending long hours in prayer, clutching her Bible as if it were a lifeline. Jessica poured her grief into determination, preparing to testify against the man who destroyed their family. Emma, caught between youth and adulthood, wrestled with emotions too heavy for her years. In her diary she wrote, "Mom, justice may come, but I don't know if it will heal me. At least, the truth is no longer hidden. I don't have to live in darkness anymore." Fairhope was transformed. Vigils for Melissa and Emma drew crowds weekly, streets lined with flowers and signs reading "Justice for Melissa and Emma." Yet alongside the prayers came whispers, skepticism, and fear of a drawn-out trial. The bells of Sunday morning church rang heavy with a lesson Fairhope could no longer ignore. Appearances can mask unthinkable darkness. By the fall of 2023, the Baldwin County Courthouse, once a stage for petty disputes, became the center of national attention. Reporters packed the halls, cameras fixed on the defendant's chair, where Scott Reynolds sat in an orange jumpsuit. His once polished image was gone, his gray-streaked hair and hollow eyes betraying months in custody. Across the courtroom sat the Carters, Mary clutching her worn Bible, Jessica glaring at the accused, and Emma between them, tears brimming but her gaze unflinching. The prosecutor rose with fire in his voice. On September 12, 2007, Scott Reynolds intentionally killed Melissa Carter and her 2-year-old daughter, Emma. After 16 years of denial, science and witness testimony have brought the truth to light. Evidence was laid before the court. The rusted red Cavalier, the remains of Melissa and Emma, and the male DNA on the steering wheel and seatbelt. DNA that genealogy traced unerringly to Scott Reynolds. There is no doubt, the prosecutor declared, he was the last person in that car. The defense struck back, insisting the DNA was no smoking gun. My client drove that Cavalier many times while dating Melissa. His DNA being there is not surprising, they argued. But the prosecution dismantled the claim, pointing to the forensic details. The DNA was on the seatbelt and the gear shift, exactly where the killer sat. 14 years of mud preserved the truth. That DNA wasn't casual. It was the final moment before the car sank. Witnesses filled the stand. One woman recalled seeing Melissa and Scott locked in a heated argument in a supermarket parking lot, just 2 days before her disappearance. Another, a close friend, testified, "She cried to me over the phone. She said she was scared of Scott. She wanted to leave him, but he wouldn't let go." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of those words pressing on every heart. Then came the prosecution's devastating climax. The screen flickered with footage of the car's recovery. The shattered windows, mud spilling out, revealing a child's car seat and a ruined teddy bear. Mary sobbed uncontrollably. Jessica wrapped her arms around her, and Emma trembled with her face buried in her hands. The prosecutor turned to the jury. This was no accident. This was a cold-blooded crime. A mother and her child were forced into that river, and the man responsible sits before you. The defense made one final plea, parading Scott's former colleagues to speak of his community work and kind gestures. But against the tide of DNA, testimony, and the haunting images, their words collapsed. Scott himself rose, his voice quaking. "I didn't kill Melissa. I loved her. It was an accident." His denial sounded hollow, an echo too weak to hold back the flood of evidence. After 2 weeks of fierce arguments, the jury withdrew. 3 hours later, they returned, faces grave. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant, Scott Reynolds, guilty of first-degree murder." Gasps rippled through the room. Mary collapsed into Jessica's arms. Emma wept openly, her tears no longer of despair, but of release. The judge's gavel thundered. Sentencing. Life in prison without parole. Justice, after 16 long years, had finally spoken. Headlines blazed. Scott Reynolds sentenced to life for murder of Melissa and Emma Carter. TV cameras replayed the haunting image of Emma, clutching her mother's framed photo in the courthouse. Hallway, eyes wet but steady. Jessica, in a post-trial interview, said, "Nothing will bring my sister or niece back, but at least he can never hurt anyone again. At least Melissa and Emma can finally rest." Emma herself whispered into cameras, "I grew up in the shadow of this case. Today I see light. Mom, justice has come." Fair hope slowly settled into calm, but the scar remained, a reminder that evil can hide behind polished facades, and that justice, though late, has the power to uncover truth. That autumn afternoon, the sun cast golden rays over the small cemetery, at Fairhope's edge. Fresh flowers adorned the new gravestone of Melissa and Emma Carter. Mary sat quietly in her folding chair, her frail hands resting on her Bible, whispering to the souls of her daughter and granddaughter. Beside her, Jessica knelt, fingers tracing the engraved names. "Melissa, we finally know what happened. But it doesn't fill the emptiness inside." Emma, now 18, stood tall before the grave, holding a faded photograph of her as a baby, in her mother's arms. Her long hair swayed in the breeze as she whispered, "Mom, I know the truth now. I know who stole you from me. But I also know you'll never be forgotten. I promise to carry your memory for the rest of my life." Mary sobbed as Jessica squeezed her niece's hand, passing her strength. The trial was over. The life sentence was final. But the Carter family's grief remained unhealed. Melissa would never return. Little Emma would never rise from the cold earth. "I have an answer," Mary often said, "but it only makes my heart heavier. I lost my daughter, my granddaughter, and my faith in people." For Jessica, every familiar street was a knife, reminders of laughter and dreams stolen by one man's rage.